Hi, today we're going to talk about jails and prisons. Specifically, we're going to go over a little bit of the different types of jails and prisons we had historically. Then we're going to talk about prisonization and what happens when you are incarcerated. So the first thing is the Quakers. So the Quakers were a religious group. They believed very much in helping individuals. William Penn was also a Quaker, and they wanted to find a more humane system that limited the death penalty to only certain types, and that they wanted house of corrections that were to be built essentially to allow people time to have penance, so hence the name penitentiary. They wanted them to really stop and think about what they did was wrong. So the first one is in Philadelphia. Walnut Street Jail was an infamous jail. It was the nation's first prison. Essentially, it was a wing of the jail. So just to be mindful that a jail is typically under 2 years and it's local, and a prison nowadays it's usually more than 2 years and they send you away. Sometimes it can be close to you, but often it's in the middle of nowhere because it's usually a much larger facility than a jail. So at this time, historically, we're looking at a wing of the jail, so part of the jail. It housed serious felons, not those that had been sentenced to death. They had solitary cells that were about 6 by 8, and the wing became known as the penitentiary house. In the Pennsylvania system, within this, solitary confinement was within cell labor. They were allowed out of their cell for 1 hour per day. It was based on religion and religious philosophy, and they were to reflect on their wrongdoing. And it was hopeful that they could improve upon their moral character. Hence, like I said, the word penitentiary is to give penance. They did not, in the Pennsylvania system, want inmates together. They wanted them to actually reflect. So in the Eastern Penitentiary, you'll see these pods here. So what you're seeing over here is a central pod, and then you're going to see these tiers. This would be up and down. We don't make them like this anymore because it was really quite dangerous for the correctional officers, but that is what it sort of looked like initially. And then we see a different system out of New York. It was called the tier system, and the Auburn system was crime prevention through fear of punishment. It was a military regimentation, good gravy, sorry, and it had a congregate work condition, so they would come together and they would work. But at night, they were separate and silent. So at night, they were kept apart. Their silence was key to discipline, and they were the ones that we saw, which we still have today, the prison stripes and the hole. And the hole is another word for solitary confinement. And that is typically when individuals don't do well, they get sent to the hole. So which system prevailed? So the Auburn system prevailed. We see that today. So contract systems of labor, officials sold labor of inmates to private business for use inside and also out of the facility. And then the convict lease system is that private businesses would lease prisoners from the state for a full fixed fee and assume full responsibility of supervision and control. Today we mainly have prison industry that is, most license plates across the United States are made by inmates. A lot of eyeglasses are made from inmate labor. And it depends on where the facility is. There's other prison industry for agriculture and farming and things like that. But the prison labor system was a way to take the prisoners cheap or free labor and allow others to profit. The reformatory movement was concerned with the nation's prison system. They thought that it wasn't deterring crime, that they weren't reforming offenders, because recall, they were supposed to give penance, think about it, and make reformation while they were inside. And during the 1870s and 1910, they said they also weren't making profit. So the future of the overcrowded, understaffed, and costly prison system came into question. And then we see on the heels of that, 1870 to 1910, there was a meeting in Cincinnati, the National Prison Association, that really gave birth to what we call the rehabilitation. And so this is the idea that we can help individuals. So we were looking for pardon me, a new type of institution, the reformatory. So we were looking for education, vocational training, intermediate sentences, allowing for parole, and then the classification of individuals. And what they mean by classification is that we could actually classify the we could classify the individuals for whether they are at low, moderate, high security, and then we can also place them in a facility accordingly. And then Elmira Reformatory, 1877 in New York, Zebulon Brockway. He came by to change the purpose of incarceration from custody to education. He believed that education was the key to rehabilitation. He wanted to diagnose and treat offenders. That was really the key element for him. He wanted individualized programs, so he wanted a rigid schedule of work in the day, and then he wanted academics, vocational, moral learning at night. So it was the mark of a system of classification. 1974, we're going to go forward a little bit. Martinson says was the idea that nothing works, and this was a move away from the rehabilitation, and so it was seen as really the death knell to rehabilitation programs, the failure of the medical model to rehabilitate, and that it had high recidivism rates, and that we saw increase in prison violence and increase in prison cost. The irony of Martinson's Nothing Works is that it actually did work. It worked 30% of the time, and quite frankly, if we had a cancer pill today that said that we could work 30% of the time, we would be okay with that. But we were not okay with that when we're looking at reforming individuals. So it ended up really switching the trajectory of where we're looking at for inmates and what we're doing with them. So I'm going to switch a little bit and talk about what does it like to live in prison. Usually imagine big house, maximum security. Institutions can be quite diverse. Goffman, in his book Asylum, described prison as a total institution. Prisons are certainly influenced by the outside world. They're closed off by that world, but that doesn't mean that within the facility they don't have their own bureaucracy. So a total institution is an institutional setting in which persons share some characteristics, are cut off from a wider society, expected to live according to institutional rules. The inmate society lives what is considered convict code. These are the values and norms, mores that regulate the way inmates interact with one another and as well as the prison staff. And then the principles of the convict code include the inmates should mind their own affairs, do their own time. They should not inform the staff about illicit activities of other prisoners, so, no tattling. They should not be indifferent to staff and loyal to other convicts. And conning and manipulation skills are in fact valued, as are the ability to show strength, courage, and toughness. Two major themes of the origins in the inmate society are the deprivation model and the importation model. There's been a lot of research about this to say, well, are you the way that you are within a prison facility because you've been deprived, or are you the way that you are within a prison society because you have imported your own values and mores? So the deprivation model explains prison society as a reaction to the shared deprivation of prison life. So again, when to pee, when to eat, when to sleep, when to go to programming, when to go to school, all of that stuff. So the idea is that when an inmate enters prison for the first time, they experience this prisonization, according to Don Clemmer. Prisonization is the process by which an inmate becomes socialized. So that's really important, that in the deprivation model that we're saying that they become socialized into the customs and the principles of the inmate society. Who to look out for, who not to look out for, who you can talk to, where you can sit. The longer the inmate stays in prison, the more prisonized they become, and the more likely they will return to crime after their release, because it just becomes a way of life for those. The importation model is a little bit different. So they suggest that the inmate society is shaped by the attributes that the inmates bring with them when they enter to prison. So it's not that the prison has deprived them of things like the deprivation model, and therefore that's the way that they are. This is saying that this is who they were on the front end. So inmates who were thieves and persistently associated with other thieves before going to prison bring the norms and values of thieves into prison. Generally, law-abiding people will be more likely to be loyal to staff norms while in prison. Today's inmate society is really fragmented, disorganized, and somewhat unstable because of the increasing racial heterogeneity. It's just a fancy word for saying that there's a lot of different races and ethnicities pushed together. The racial polarization of modern prisoners, quite frankly, when you come in, you really do need to pick a side. So a lot of time it is by your skin color, it's by maybe a previous gang. But it's very difficult for folks to come into a prison and have no affiliation. If that's true, then by the time you're there after a week, you will have an affiliation because it's really for your own safety. Courtroom litigation, the rise and fall of rehabilitation has changed what we do with inmates within a facility. And then the increased politicization of inmates and how everybody says we're all get tough, no matter you're left, right, or center. There's more physical violence by inmates in today's men's prison than there were in earlier years. The reasons is improper management and classification, practices by staff. There's a lot of crowding and competition over finite or small resources. The age of most inmates in today's prison, including a federal prison, is very young. This is based on the war on drugs and the minimum mandatory sentencing. So we've seen an overall decline of our ages of a lot of our inmates. And then we see racial tensions and, in fact, prison gang activities. Common motives for physical violence are to demonstrate power, retaliate against a perceived wrong, or really just prevention. And so that is what I was saying earlier, is that you really do have to pick a side. A good deal of prison violence, but not all, definitely has sexual overtones. So there's a thing called PREA, which is Prison Rape Extinguishing App. Prison Rape Extinguishing App. That sounds wrong to me. I got to check on that. Sorry. But PREA is a way to, eliminate. There you go. Prison Rape Elimination Act. PREA is a way to eliminate rape and sexual assault. And you're allowed to report it without anyone knowing. It's all confidential. But, in a facility, a bureaucracy like a prison, similar to other bureaucracies you may have ever belonged to, whether high school or a club, oftentimes people know who's snitching. So it's not always sex-driven, but a lot of times it is who's in control, yes. So instances of prison sex can be further divided into three categories. Consensual, so those individuals that a lot of time will have consensual sex while in a male facility inside. We would say that was same sex, but on the outside, they would still consider themselves heterosexual. So on the inside, they will have same sex, but still consider themselves heterosexual when they get released. Prostitution, so those individuals that are making money, and then sexual assault. So physical victimization is not the only or even the most frequent kind of victimization. Other kinds include economic, psychological, or social. And these, quite frankly, can be perpetrated by inmates and or also staff. And so when we're talking about economics, that's like stealing someone's canteen to make sure that they get enough cigarettes from somebody else. Psychological, that would be messing with someone. And then social is to say, like, who can hang out with whom. Like all societies, the inmate society has an economy with a black market known as the sub rosa economy. And that black market is things like, getting a cigarette. So if you can get somebody to give you a pack of cigarettes, then you can turn around and sell them on the black market for a lot more money for those individuals that don't have the canteen. So cigarettes are served as a medium of exchange. One of the newest forms of prison contraband are cell phones. So this is a really big deal that inmates will try very religiously to try and get access to cell phones. The sub rosa economy sets the stage for various kinds of economic victimization, theft, robbery, fraud, extortion, and loan sharking. The psychological victimization has manipulation tactics and mind games. Members threaten to expose information from an inmate's file. So that is the individuals that are watching over the inmates. In fact, yes, they are the ones that can manipulate as well. So telling an inmate that they know things in their file and using that knowledge against them to get them to do something or get them to, harm somebody if they are not, if they do something to the prison guard or prison officer. Social victimization incurs prejudice of race, age, class background, religious preference, political positions, and other factors. Gang membership. Prison life includes pronounced deprivation of personal freedom. So again, when to go to the bathroom, when to eat, when to take a shower, loss of privacy. Depending on where, if you have a job within the facility, you might have to be strip searched and bend over each time to make sure that you are not carrying contraband. Competition for scarce resources. So when you sit down to dinner or lunch and somebody wants an extra roll, it depends on that person that has the power will get that roll. And then greater insecurity, stress, and unpredictability. To cope, discourage personal responsibility and independence, create excessive dependency on authority, and diminishing personal control over life events. And so these are a lot different than what life is like in the free society. So when we talk about adjustment, the adjustment becomes very difficult for an inmate once they're coming back because the concept of doing time, getting out as soon as possible and avoiding hard time, making sure that they can take advantages of resources, gleaning for personal betterment while they're in a facility. So there's programs that they could do. And this is all about men's facility. I'm going to briefly talk about women's. For the most part, anybody that I've ever talked to that works in a male or female facility, hands down, without a doubt, would rather work in a male facility. Female facilities, even though they're less violent, they are very loud. Women often will talk at the officers, the prison guards, the prison officers a lot more. They ask them a lot more questions. They're constantly back and forth battling with the officer. So even though their personal life is more at risk in a male facility, hands down, most folks will say that they would much rather work in a men's facility. So like men's, it's similar that they don't have the ability to have independence. They can't, roam freely, but they really are often less oppressive. So the interesting thing about women's facilities are often the individual is there often for a less serious crime. So we don't have across the country, women are not usually at the high rates of violence like men are. Women create these pseudo families within the facility, so they like to identify in their within the prison who is like their mom and their sister, and these are their communities. And this becomes a problem for the correctional officers because you're not supposed to have any sort of touching, or you're not supposed to share things. And so with these pseudo families, they're like, oh, well, she's my sister, she's my mom. And so it becomes a little bit more difficult to have these women to adhere to the rules. So family activity, homosexual activity, relatively independent of one another. The majority of female inmates who participated in homosexual activity were heterosexual, like I said, similar to the men. There's a couple different kinds of roles that women adopt to. There's a square, who were non-criminals, intent towards conventional behavior. A life, those are the ones that, are habitual. They are lifers. They have antisocial, anti-authority. And then your cools are those that are try to do easy time by manipulating others. When we look at correctional officers, we say that most studies of prison staff have concentrated on guards because they represent the majority of staff members. They're responsible for the security, and they have most contact with the inmates. The correctional officers face a number of conflicts. It's often bored at some points, and then stimulus went just like a police officer, that the majority of their time is just riding around, and then they have a split-second decision, similar to the correctional officers in a facility. They have a hard time trying to both supervise and counsel the inmates. So at one level, they're their supervisor, and they're supposed to tell them what to do, get in line, don't go over the yellow line when you're walking down the facility, the yellow line. But then at another time, the inmate might want some companionship, and just to kind of talk to the officer about maybe their husband at home, something's wrong, and so they just want to confide in somebody. So this becomes this lack of clear guidelines with the officers on how to deal with their discretion with inmates, and it does have a difficult time with compliance. So how do correctional officers respond? Well, some become alienated and cynical. Others become overly authoritarian. Others become corrupt, and they're the ones that are bringing drugs into the facility for the manipulative inmates. And then some adopt a human service orientation to try and help people. Efforts are trying to be made to transform prison work, really to professionalize prison work, very similarly to how we professionalize police. However, here's the problem. Number one, they don't get a lot of money. They're often in the middle of nowhere. So it becomes really difficult to get a good workforce. Affirmative action has resulted in tensions and resentment by Caucasian or white officers. The training standards aren't uniform across, and the professionalism by unions. And so when we look at, inmate rights and prison reform, the courts followed a hands-off philosophy towards prison matters. As a consequence, prisoners essentially had no civil rights. And then once the 60s came along, they had more civil rights. Cooper v. Pate was the idea about conditions of confinement. And so the ability in federal court to challenge the confinement, but the conditions of their confinement, access to the courts and the legal system, legal services. Habeas corpus is a Latin word that means bring the body forward. And so that means that a confined person can be brought to court, so his or her claims can be heard. And in the Cooper v. Pate decision, it launched the prisoners' rights movement by opening the door for new claims from the inmates. By 1990s, Congress had become overwhelmed with the amount of litigation that was in the courts. And so in 1995, they passed the Prison Litigation Reform Act. And this was really just to restrict and discourage inmates from litigating things. So, for example, there were inmates that would litigate they can't eat green Jell-O because it was part of their religion, or that was being a little bit of a drastic litigation. But then there were others that would say, as part of their religion, they can't eat pork, or as part of their religion, they can't, they do the Sabbath on Saturday and they're not giving them the time. So another litigation was to make sure that they could see the sun at least one time a day for as little as an hour. So to get their cases to court, the prisoners needed access to legal materials. A lot of them did not have it in the facility. So the Supreme Court has held that the jailhouse lawyers must be permitted to assist other inmates. And so jailhouse lawyers are either individuals that are bright enough to be able to read through the legal documents, or they might have previously been an attorney on the outside. So the jailhouse lawyer doesn't really mean that it's a true lawyer within the jailhouse. It's just that somebody that maybe was a paralegal had some access to information ahead of time. Procedural due process. So, yep, prisoners can get disciplinary action for breaking prison rules. And in fact, they often get a lot more time added to their sentence, or they could be bumped up to another facility. So if they were at a low, they bump up to a medium, high goes to supermax. The U.S. Supreme Court has held that they are entitled to due process, that they can have to have a disciplinary hearing. They have to have written notice of the charges 24 hours in advance. They have to have written statement of the evidence relied on, and then the opportunity for them to be able to call. And it sounds very much like our adversarial system in the outside. The First Amendment rights guarantees freedom of speech, press, assembly. So the U.S. Supreme Court had made numerous decisions in this era to make sure that censoring of the inmate's mail is legal only if it furthers one or more of the following substantial government interests: security, order, rehabilitation. I can guarantee you that every facility I've ever been in, they say that it's for security. So you can absolutely know that every time a letter comes in or out of a facility, it's getting read by someone else. Religious freedom was another concern. Inmates are free to practice conventional or unconventional religions. Restrictions can be imposed where prison officials can demonstrate convincingly that the practices have compromised their security. So if that's true, then in the name of security, then they might deny them that opportunity. So the Eighth Amendment, as you know, outlaws the imposition of cruel and unusual. They've considered a number of factors under this. Pardon me. In Estelle versus Gamble in 1976, they ruled that an inmate has the right to have adequate medical care. Inmates claiming Eighth Amendment violations on medical grounds must demonstrate that the prison officials had shown deliberate indifference. So that's a pretty high standard, that they have to have deliberate indifference. Staff brutality is something that also could come under the Eighth Amendment. The Supreme Court found that the staff use of force against an inmate need not cause a significant physical injury. So, why did they create an injury? And that's what they would ask about. Holt versus Sarver in Arkansas prison was declared unconstitutional because the totality of the conditions was ordered and implemented a variety of changes. And this is just simply saying, that some combination of prison practices and conditions makes the whole prison as unconstitutional. I have been in facilities before that have been shut down because the Supreme Court has said either they don't have access to the ability to see sunshine, they don't have access to see another human being, or the entire way they lock everybody down. So the Supreme Court definitely still allows inmates to have rights and reasonableness. Total prison conditions. So as long as they have food, shelter, clothing, and medical care. Nothing about that saying quality. So mystery meat is in fact a thing. It is given to inmates. It's a lot of dried milk, powdered milk, and I think it's powdered spinach, and sometimes there's also meat in there and other times there's not, and it fulfills the dietary qualifications. It's not good, but it still is something that fulfills the ability to say that you're getting fed. The 14th Amendment, due process under law. So just that the female facilities often will not have as much access to things as a male facility, and that really is based on numbers. So I would say 85 to 90% of our total prison population is men. So when we're looking at 10% of the whole population is female, it's very difficult to have a law library for women, have prison industry just for women. So historically, we used to have men's facilities next to women's facilities, and then they would share the resources. Co-corrections is what they called it, and that's not necessarily the way of the game today. The limits of litigation, again, so that the court just wanted to make sure that they could get a way to have due process, but just they were not they could limit frivolous lawsuits. So it's expensive. It could take years. And so the idea was, again, just to make sure that they were only doing lawsuits that meant for a large majority of people. So release and recidivism, inmates may be released from prison in a number of ways. They could either expire their maximum sentence, or they could get commutation, and that's just the reduction of the original sentence. They could be released at the discretion of the parole authority. You'll hear about that next week, or they could do a mandatory release. And so parole is the conditional release of prisoners before they've served their full sentence. Again, you're going to hear about this again next week. In jurisdictions that permit parole release, eligibility has to require inmates serve a portion. Often that is 80%. So truth in sentencing laws that came out in the last couple decades, you have to serve at least 80% of your sentence. Before, it used to be you could do good time or twofers, which is 2 for 1 day. So if you were in for 100 days, you got 200 days off your sentence, but we really don't do twofers anymore. A mandatory release is just that, is that they've served enough of their sentence, so they're going to get released. And then recidivism is this idea that you will commit an illegal activity again. So you are held in a facility for a certain amount of time, and then you get released, and then you recidivate because you've either done a reconviction, a rearrest, a reconviction, or a violation of parole. And so they can bring you back. So when we look at release and recidivism, Ben Crouch found that newly incarcerated offenders frequently express a preference for prison over probation. Again, those folks that have done the system again and again, they would rather just do their time, get off paper, and not have somebody watch over them. Lynn Goodstein demonstrated the inmates adjust most successfully are the ones that had difficulty adjusting to life in the free community upon release. So a lot of times our folks that are chronic offenders, sometimes they see their relatives in the facility. Sometimes it's just all they know. So it's what they're used to, what they grew up with. So when we look at the way that the different types of prisons, so ultra maximum, this is the most dangerous predatory criminals. This is the highest escape and assault potential. Extra tight security, isolated conditions, all potential weapons are removed, mirrors, toilet seat, soap, dishes. The way in a Supermax facility, the cost of the toilet is like maybe $40,000-$50,000 because it's all one. You see the stool there, so it's very, very expensive. And then you'll see here, so there's a vestibule here. Here's your slider, so the prison door that opens up. A lot of times the inmate will have to take off all their clothes, put it through the sliders, bend over, make sure they don't have anything in an orifice, and then have the officer that's standing out here look at your clothes, pass them back. You then you then get to put them back on, and then you back up with your hands against the gate, and then they will put your hands in handcuffs, and then and only then do they open up the sliding door. And then once they come in there, then they put your feet in shackles as well, and then they'll remove your hands from behind to front, and then they put a little box on it to make sure that it can get up to your chest really closely, so that you have very little movement of your arms and your hands to go anywhere in a facility in a Supermax. So if you have a medical check, if you have to have a dentist appointment, if you have to go get a pill, whatever, they do this process for any sorts of movement. And then when you're in a Supermax, you're often just in your cell by yourself. And so those are the ones that people that they've often gotten Supreme Court cases to say it's cruel and unusual punishment. So a maximum is a step down. So these are cells blocks. You can actually, they can't necessarily see each other, but they make mirrors to be able to see individuals they could see across, but they can't see next to them. So inmates are considered escape prone, focus on safety and security. And these are your tiers. It's not necessarily how we do our facilities anymore. This makes for it very unsafe. So as your correctional officer is walking down, they do not know what an inmate is going to throw at them. A lot of times feces or urine or something like that, or sometimes fireballs are thrown at them. So we don't make our prisons that way anymore. This is just the you'll see how many times that you do count, live count, live count, live count, live count, live count. So just making sure you're constantly having a count off that nobody's escaped. Medium looks a little bit like a maximum, but the security is less intense. You have more treatment programs. And then your minimum. These are no armed guards. Sometimes these look just like a halfway house in a community. It looks, there's often, they can come and go as they want. And then a jail. So we'll talk a tiny bit about a jail. It's a local correctional institution, operative word local. It holds people waiting trial. So there could be a lot of reasons why you're in a jail. You could either be waiting trial or sentencing, or you could be a misdemeanor offender sentenced to a term of less than really 2 years now. Who's held in jail? So on the front end, waiting for trial, held during the progress of trial if you weren't given bail, and then you're waiting post-conviction, waiting for sentencing. So you could have people that violated their probation, violated their parole, or they violated their bail. They could all be in a jail. You could have juveniles that are waiting to be transferred. But if a juvenile's in a facility, in a jail, they're not supposed to be within eye shot or earshot of an adult. You could have mentally ill that waiting to be transferred to mental health facilities, or inmates waiting for transfer to another facility. So sometimes folks can get transferred for a variety of reasons. Maybe their family's moving, so they want to move closer to their family. Maybe they've become a problem in this current facility, so they get transferred out. So the profile of the inmates, 2/3 didn't graduate from high school, 2/3 are under the age of 35. You see the racial breakdown there. Drug use, 21 were drug offenders, 70% were drunk or high at the time of their offense, 43 raised by single parent, 56% had a child that was under the age of 18, and that is a gendered effect. If it's men, they were not often the primary caretaker. If it's women, they were often the primary caretaker of the kids before they went into facility. So why have inmate populations grown? A lot of public demand for punitive punishment, the lock them up, throw away the key, the mandatory determinate sentencing. So determinate sentencing is you get to determine it based on what you do. So I apologize. So determine is that on the front end, you know how much time you're going to have to do, and it's mandatory a lot of times from federal guidelines. So we have a lot of drug and violent crimes, more drug than before. Violent is gone down recently. Increased use of incarceration by judges, and then lack of employment opportunities to slow them down coming back in. So we do have California and Texas are over 100% capacity. So they double, triple bunk. They put folks in tents or military bases. They put them on river barges because, again, constitutionally, you have to be out of your cell for so long a day. And so what they'll do is they just constantly in New York, New Jersey, put folks on barges, and then you ride around on a barge for a couple hours and you can go back in the facility, and then somebody else gets on the barge and rides around. So it's really just a numbers game. Private prisons have kind of become a big deal. The idea is that they can manage better. The problem with private prisons is that they could cut into their profit for their safety. And so we worry that if they need to make a profit, that they might release individuals that we as a government might think that they would not be safe, but they say, well, they're safe, so they can let them go. 85% are not first-time offenders. The longer a former prisoner stays out of prison, the less likely he or she is to return to prison. So that's why sometimes you'll see recidivism studies that say, oh, well, they've been, 3 years out without being recidivist. And that's really great. Men recidivate at a higher rate than women. We see whites recidivate at lower rates. And again, this is just the recidivism. It's the repetition of criminal behavior, habitual criminal. The current estimate is that 50% of all inmates will be back in prison within 6 years. And that's a crazy thought. And this just goes back to something that you'll hear next week, is that the idea that our United States does not do a good job of reintegrating the inmate back into society. So you can do your time, but once you've done your time, what happens? And some would say that we continue to punish the individual because they cannot get a job, a good job. They can maybe get an underemployed job, but they can't get a good job that they could feel quality and pride about, because in our culture, not many people want to take an ex-con and have them work for them. That's all I have for you. Thank you.